There you go. Okay, let's get started. Stop banging pans and we'll get going. Today we get to the good stuff. But before we start on part 3 of the treatise, book 1, I have to make one big correction. I told you all that you could ignore part 2, but I was wrong. There's one little section at the end of part 2 that is really worth taking a look at. It's a little section called Of the Idea of Existence and of External Existence. It's only 2 pages long, but it is really important. And so I am going to say just a few words about it. Hume argues that we have no idea of existence separate from our other ideas, for of what would it be a copy? We have no impression of existence, therefore we have no idea of existence. And he then says, this is on pages 66 and 67, to reflect on anything simply and to reflect on it as existent are nothing different from each other. That idea, when conjoined with the idea of any object, makes no addition to it. And when I reread that, all of a sudden something exploded in my head, because that, of course, is the essence of Kant's famous refutation of the ontological argument for the existence of God. And indeed, you remember Kant, if those of you who've read the critique will recall that in the transcendental dialectic, Kant says the following. It's a famous comment in his refutation of the ontological argument. He says, 100 real thalers do not contain the least coin more than 100 possible thalers. That's the most famous tagline from his refutation of the proofs for the existence of ontological argument for the existence of God. Whoops, I may have to mute everybody. I think I will, just so that I don't. But you can unmute yourself anytime you want to raise a question or make a comment. And then we get this remark from part 3, section 7. Here's what Hume says later on. When we affirm that God is existent, we simply form the idea of such a being as he is represented to us, nor is the existence which we attribute to him conceived by a particular idea which we join to the idea of his other qualities and can again separate and distinguish from them. When I think of God, when I think of him as existent, and when I believe him to be existent, my idea of him neither increases nor diminishes. That is exactly Kant's refutation of the ontological argument for the existence of God. Only Hume did it, if I can put it this way, 42 years earlier and in English. I'm reminded, I was thinking of this just a few minutes ago, I'm reminded of the famous remark about Ginger Rogers in the old Ginger Rogers Fred Astaire movies. Ginger did everything Fred did, only backwards and in heels. And I have the feeling that you could say the same thing about Hume. He did everything Kant did, only he did it 42 years earlier in English. At any rate, I just wanted to start with that so that I wouldn't miss that important section in the otherwise forgettable part 2. But now we get to the big kahuna, part 3 of knowledge and probability. This is where we find Hume's famous discussion of causation. Part 3 is a very long part. It's 110 pages long, but a lot of it can be ignored. It's very boring. If you're paying attention with the text in front of you, you can ignore sections 9 through 13 and 15 and 16, unless you happen to be a pet lover, in which case you can read his section on rules of the reason of animals, which is the end of part 3. But leaving that to one side, the really crucial arguments are found in 2 sections. Section 3, why a cause is always necessary, and section 14 of the idea of necessary connection. Those are the key sections. Hume starts off by painting a big canvas and then getting everything to one side. He starts off in section 1 by identifying 7 different kinds of philosophical relations: resemblance, identity, relations of time and place, proportion in quantity or number, degrees in inequality, contrariety, and causation. Right away, he gets rid of 4 of them by saying that there are 4 of them, which depend entirely on the ideas, not on how or where they appear in our experience. Those four are resemblance of impressions or ideas, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportions in quantity or number. And Hume is not interested in them, so he just brushes them aside. That leaves three: identity, relations of time and place, and causation. Obviously, relations of time and place vary depending on when and where the impressions arrive. If they arrive at a different time or in a different place, that changes the relation of space and time. And identity is the same for reasons we'll talk about later. But the one he's really interested in is causation, because, and this is the crucial point, page 74. Here then it appears that of these three relations which depend not upon the mere ideas, the only one that can be traced beyond our senses and informs us of existence and objects which we do not see or feel is causation. Causation is the one relation that takes us beyond one person waiting. Hold on. Okay, Dave is now admitted. This causation is the one relation that takes us beyond the mix of impressions that come to us and the copies we make of them, which we call ideas, and leads us to believe in, to think about, to reason about things that are not present to our senses. And causation, it fills our world out, as it were. And that's the one that Hume really wants to look at. That's the subject of the remainder of part 3. And now he asks, where do we get the idea of causal connection from? It's clearly not, we don't get it from the qualities of the objects we identify as cause. If you take a look at let's suppose, to take an example, that you're talking about fire and the heat that the fire causes. You have an impression of the fire, a visual impression of the fire. You see the fire, but nothing in the sight of the fire gives you the sense of it as, gives the idea of it as a cause of something. You simply see the fire. So if it's not in the qualities of the object we identify as cause, then Hume says it must be from the relations between the objects we identify as cause and effect. And these relations are two in number. First of all, the cause and the effect are temporally successive. Hume has a long portion that I don't want to bother about, talking about the possibility of the cause and effect being simultaneous. And he makes it clear that even if they are simultaneous, we identify one as before the other in the order of causation. So they are temporally successive, and they are spatially contiguous. No action at a distance, as it were. Those are the two characteristics that we identify as the characteristics of all things that we think of as cause and effect. But that is not all. There's something else, and it's the something else that Hume spends the rest of part 3 talking about. He says, shall we then rest contented with these two relations of contiguity and succession as affording a complete idea of causation? By no means, says Hume. An object may be contiguous and prior to another without being considered as its cause. There is, he says, a necessary connection to be taken into consideration, and that relation is of much greater importance than any of the other two above mentioned. Indeed, that's the whole ball of wax, the necessary connection which we think connects causes to effects, and so that we think of the cause as necessitating the effect, not simply as being in the same region as it or as coming after it. Lots of things are in the same region as other things and come before or right after them, and we don't identify them as the cause of those things. That's the necessary connection, and it is the central issue of part 3. And now Hume asks two fundamental questions. Right on page 78, he says, first of all, for what reason we pronounce it necessary that everything whose existence has a beginning should also have a cause. That is the causal maxim. That's the first question. Why do we assert the causal maxim? And the second question, why we conclude that such particular causes must necessarily have such particular effects, and what is the nature of that inference we draw from the one to the other, and of the belief we repose in it. Now, he starts out by talking about the first one, the causal maxim. That is the negative part of part 3, and I'll get to that in just immediately. That is the heart of the negative argument of part 3, and it is, although very short, devastatingly powerful. The rest of the discussion concerns the question, why is it that, how do we come to believe that some things cause others, and what is the nature of that belief? What produces it? And that is the positive part of part 3. Hume starts off in section 3 with the first question, why a cause is always necessary. And now, in just 2 paragraphs, 2 relatively short paragraphs, Hume devastates 2 millennia of claims about causal inference. It was this, I will tell you the story in a little bit, it was this that awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumbers, led him to postpone publishing the Critique of Pure Reason for 9 years or so, and led to the entirely revolutionary theories of the critique. And this, just to go back to my story from the first day, is the thought that occurred to me when I was taking my senior generals at Harvard 69 years ago. Here are the 2 paragraphs from section 3. I'm going to read them, and I may actually read them again, because this is the whole ball of wax. One of the reasons why I do so much reading from Hume is that he writes so much better than I do, and so much better than almost anybody does. And because of that, it seems to me I can't do any better than just present you with his words. Here are the 2 paragraphs. All certainty arises from the comparison of ideas, and from the discovery of such relations as are unalterable, so long as the ideas continue the same. These relations, which give genuine knowledge, says Hume, are resemblance, proportions in quantity and number, degrees of inequality, and contrariety, none of which are implied in this proposition, whatever has a beginning has also a cause of existence. That proposition, therefore, is not intuitively certain. And then he goes on. But here is an argument which proves at once that the foregoing proposition is neither intuitively nor demonstratively certain. And here's the whole refutation of causation. We can never demonstrate the necessity of a cause to every new existence or new modification of existence without showing at the same time the impossibility there is that anything can ever begin to exist without some productive principle. And where the latter proposition cannot be proved, we must despair of ever being able to prove the former. Now that the latter proposition is utterly incapable of a demonstrable proof, we may satisfy ourselves by considering. And here is, remember I tagged this proposition from part 1 because I said it was going to be important. As all distinct ideas are separable from each other, and as the idea of cause and effect are evidently distinct, it will be easy for us to conceive any object to be non-existent this moment and existent the next, without conjoining to it the distinct idea of a cause or productive principle. Since the idea of the cause and the idea of the effect are separable, we can imagine one without the other. The separation, therefore, of the idea of a cause from that of the beginning of existence is plainly possible for the imagination. And consequently, the actual separation of these objects is so far possible that it implies no contradiction nor absurdity, and is therefore incapable of being refuted by any reasoning from mere ideas, without which it is impossible to demonstrate the necessity of a cause. And there it is. That's the whole refutation of the causal maxim. We can distinguish, suppose we are talking about as the cause and the effect, the motion of one billiard ball on a billiard table, striking another billiard ball, and then the second billiard ball starting to move. and we say that the first billiard balls hitting the second billiard ball is the cause, and the movement of the second billiard ball is the effect. We can imagine the first billiard ball hitting the second billiard ball without the second billiard ball moving. We can imagine the second billiard ball moving without anything having hit it, without the first billiard ball having hit it. Since we can imagine that, it is at least so far possible that we cannot show that it is logically impossible for that to be the case. And if that is so, then it cannot be that we have knowledge that the first caused the second. That's the whole refutation. It's very simple, it's very quick, and it's devastating. Now let me tell you the story about James Beattie. Hume wrote this in the treatise and published it in 1739. And I read you the devastating critique, the devastating review that was written of the treatise by an anonymous reviewer. There were several such reviews, and they were all equally devastating, and Hume was crushed by these. So he brought out the enquiries in which he didn't go through, in which he changed some things and didn't give all of these arguments. Since it was an anonymous publication, the treatise, in 1776, shortly before his death, when he was writing this little autobiography, he disavowed it. He said, well, it was a product of his youth and it was published anonymously. And in effect, he said, never mind, I don't stand by that anymore. Now, in 1770, a man named James Beattie published a book called an essay on the nature and immutability of the truth, usually referred to simply as Essay on Truth. James Beattie was a member of the school of what was called common sense philosophers. And he wrote this book to argue against the people he called skeptics, among whom, by the way, he included Descartes, you'll be interested to know. And his argument, Beattie was a good guy. He was, for example, opposed to slavery, whereas Hume was a racist, but never mind that. Beattie was not much of a philosopher. His arguments consisted of arguments like these. David Hume says such and such, but we all know that's not true, so it isn't. That was sort of the level of power of his refutations. Needless to say, the book was an enormous success. Came out in 1770. Another edition came out in 1771, another one in 1772, another one in 73, 74, 75, 76. In 76, Beattie read Hume's little disavowal of his former work, the treatise. And Beattie rather grandly said, well, if David Hume says that he no longer believes the things in the treatise, I will go through my book and take out all the selections that I have put into the book from the treatise, which he did. So in the 1776 edition, none of those passages appear. Okay. In 1772, Kant said, that not in 72, sorry. In 1783 or 4, in the Prolegomena, he said that it was David Hume who awakened me from my dogmatic slumbers. And I thought to myself, was it Beattie who awakened him? There was good historical evidence to show that it was reading Beattie that had awakened him from his dogmatic slumbers. But I asked myself, was the translation into German of Beattie's essay made from the 76th edition, which didn't have these passages from the treatise, or from the 1770 or 71 or 72 edition, which did? So I went to Houghton Library in Harvard, which was the rare book library, and asked them whether they had a copy of the German translation of Beattie's book. I assumed they did because I was very young and I thought that Widener Library had every book ever written. And they said, no, we don't, but we will get you a microfilm of it. So they sent off God bless them, to Vienna. And back came a microfilm of the German translation of Beattie's book. And then I looked at it, and sure enough, it was a translation made from an earlier edition, from the original 1770 edition. And in it, it had the passages that Beattie had quoted from the treatise that he had dropped from the 1776 edition. So it turned out that Kant had known about Hume's skeptical critique of causation. Kant had didn't read English, and he had never read Hume's treatise, of course, but he had read Beattie, and he had read an edition that had those passages in it. I mention this because it's the only piece of genuine scholarship I've ever done in my entire life. And in 1960, I actually published an article with the exciting title, Kant's Knowledge of Hume via Beattie, in which I laid all of this out. So having told you about this, we can go on. Hume now spends some time considering objections to his argument. The objections that he imagines are pretty much the sorts of objections you would think would come up. And he has very little difficulty dispensing with them. I want to read you his treatment of one argument, which he gets from Locke, by the way, because it has a rather nice passage in it. Hume says, it is exactly the same with the third argument, and he has a footnote to Mr. Locke, which has been employed to demonstrate the necessity of a cause. Whatever is produced without a cause is produced by nothing, or in other words, has nothing for its cause. But, the argument goes, nothing can ever be a cause, no more than it can be something or equal to two right angles. By the same intuition that we perceive nothing not to be equal to two right angles or not to be something, we perceive that it can never be a cause, and consequently must perceive that every object has a real cause of its existence. It's a dumb argument given by Locke and given by many other people. And to this Hume says, it is sufficient only to observe that when we exclude all causes, we really do exclude them, and neither suppose nothing nor the object itself to be the causes of the existence, and consequently can draw no argument from the absurdity of these suppositions to prove the absurdity of that exclusion. They are still more frivolous, Hume goes on, who say that every effect must have a cause because it is implied in the very idea of effect. Every effect necessarily produces a cause, presupposes a cause, effect being a relative term of which cause is the correlative. And Hume's response is, this does not prove that every being must be preceded by a cause, no more than it follows because every husband must have a wife, that therefore every man must be married, which is a lovely and rather crushing refutation of that stupid argument. But now Hume ends the section, surprisingly, by changing the question. Here's the concluding paragraph. You'll notice I'm doing a lot of reading from Hume, and as I say, I'm reading from Hume because I can't write as well as Hume does, and I'm not going to pretend that I can. I'm just going to select the key passages and comment on them after I read them. Hume says this, since it is not from knowledge or any scientific reasoning that we derive the opinions of the necessity of a cause to every new production, that opinion must necessarily arise from observation and experience. The next question then should naturally be, how experience gives rise to such a principle. That is, how does experience give rise to the principle that every event must have a cause? But as I find it will be more convenient to sink this question in the following, why we conclude that such particular causes must necessarily have such particular effects, and why we form an inference from one to another, we shall make that the subject of our future inquiry. It will perhaps be found in the end that the same answer will serve for both questions. This is a very interesting switch, and it's a very important one. You would expect Hume to go on to ask the question, why do we believe that every event must have a cause, given that it does not follow from logic? But he doesn't talk about that. Instead, he decides to talk about this different question. How do I come to the conclusion that particular causes have particular effects? Particular events cause particular other events. And he says, perhaps it'll be found in the end that the same answer will serve for both questions. And indeed it does. But that signals a very interesting shift, as we'll see as we go on through part 3. Very quickly, Hume decides there are 3 things to explain about particular causal inferences. Now we're talking about a causal inference such as fire causes heat. First, we must talk about the original impression. Secondly, the impression in this case of fire. Second, the transition to the idea of the connected cause or effect, in this case heat. And third, the nature and qualities of that idea of the connection. About the original impression, Hume says there's nothing more we can say. It's just we don't explain how we have impressions. That's where we start. We just have them. The transition to the idea of the effect cannot be deductive, for whatever is distinguishable is so far separable in the imagination that its absence implies no contradiction. That's what he's already demonstrated. So now Hume says it is experience. There's a long passage here that I think I won't read since I've been doing so much reading. But essentially what happens, Hume says, is this. Take the example of fire and heat. We see fire and we feel heat. Later on, we see fire again, and the fire we see a second time resembles the fire we've seen the first time. It's not identical, but it resembles it. We feel heat. The heat we feel the second time is not identical with the impression of heat we had the first time, but it is a resembling impression. Over and over again, we see fire. That is, we have an impression that we identify as fire, we name it as fire, which resembles other impressions we've had before. And in each case, we find it is conjoined with a different impression, the impression of heat, which resembles other impressions we have had before. So that what we have is, as Hume puts it, a constant conjunction of resembling instances. That is the pattern that we find, a constant conjunction of resembling instances. So that is what Hume says we must explain. Contiguity and succession are not sufficient to make us pronounce any 2 objects to be cause and effect unless we perceive that these 2 relations are preserved in several instances. Now, you might imagine, but Hume is clear that this is not so, that the appearance of a constant conjunction of resembling instances is evidence that the first is the cause of the second. Not a bit of it, Hume says, because we can always imagine the second without the first or the first without the second. No matter how many times we see fire and feel heat, we can always imagine that we could see fire another time and not feel heat. And indeed, sometimes that happens. Namely, when we see fire but we're too far away from it and we don't feel any heat, or when we feel heat but we're not looking in the direction of the fire, so we don't see the fire but we feel the heat. So it can't be in the impressions that we find the connection between them. And in fact, it is, Hume said, and just let me remind you, by the way, a fact that I haven't already remarked, but which becomes clear when you read the treatise. Hume is a direct realist, as we used to call it in the old days. That is to say, Hume thinks he's not a causal realist. He doesn't think we have impressions which are caused by objects. He thinks we see the objects themselves. We call them impressions, we call them objects. There's just one collection of things, impressions that we have before us, plus the copies, the ideas. And that's all we have. We actually see the fire, we feel the heat. We don't see in our minds an impression which is a copy of or a symbol of or an indication of something else called the fire. We see the fire itself. Hume is a direct realist. So, after observing a constant conjunction of resembling instances, something happens, not in the world, but in us. And this is the move which is the essential part of Hume's philosophy. We develop a habit of expecting the heat when we see the fire, of expecting the second billiard ball to roll when we see the first billiard ball hitting it. We develop a habit in us. Now, why do we develop this habit? This is a very interesting and important question, and one that Hume doesn't really discuss, although he tells you why, but he doesn't discuss the significance of it. We develop this habit because we are the sorts of people, we are the sorts of creatures who have built into us a disposition or propensity to develop habits of certain sorts. And one of the kinds of habits that we have a disposition to develop is the habit of associating constantly conjoined resembling instances and expecting one when we see the other, when we have an impression of the other. It's a habit in us, not something in the world. And so what happens is we develop a habit, and when we see the fire, we expect after a while, once we've developed the habit of conjoining fire with heat, when we see the fire, we expect the heat. When we see one billiard ball striking a second, we expect the second one to move. That habit is in us. Now, just to get ahead of myself, this habit, which is in us and which is something that all of us have, plays exactly the same role as Kant's categories, strange as that may seem. The categories are brought to experience by the mind. They are not extracted from experience by the mind. The categories are imposed upon our sensory experience. Our habits are imposed upon our sensory experience. So Hume says, now there's one more thing that has to be discussed, namely, we believe that the heat will occur. We believe that the second ball will roll away. We don't just have a habit of associating the ideas, we also have a belief. And remember what a belief is, according to Hume. A belief is nothing but an enlivened idea, a particularly forceful idea. So what happens is, we see fire, we feel heat. We see fire, we feel heat. We see fire, we feel heat. We develop a habit in us because of our disposition of developing a habit of expectation like this. We develop the habit of associating fire with heat. When we see the fire, that leads us to conjure up the idea of heat. And because of this habit, the idea that we conjure up is enlivened, not merely by the impression of fire, but by the habit. It is enlivened by the habit, and so we believe that there is heat when we see the fire. And that is Hume's explanation of causal inference. That's how particular causal inferences work. Hume says, belief does nothing but vary the manner in which we conceive any object. It can only bestow on our ideas an additional force and vivacity. An opinion, therefore, or belief may be most accurately defined: a lively idea related to or associated with a present impression. And that's it. That's it, save for one more element, which we will get to much later in part 3, namely the notion that the fire and the heat are necessarily connected. That necessary connection is the last part of the element in causal inference, and it's something he will get to much later on. But let me just go back and talk about this some, because it is such an important moment in Hume's philosophy, and I think in philosophy in general. Remember when I introduced the notion of association, when Hume introduced it in part 1, he described it as a gentle force, analogizing it to the force of gravity in Newton's physics. But of course, there is no gentle force that associates ideas with other ideas, or impressions with other impressions. The association is in us. It is our habit that associates them. The habit that we develop, which associates the one with the other. We think about heat when we see fire because we have developed in us a habit of associating the one with the other. So the association is actually a characteristic of the mind's activity. It is not a characteristic of the impressions or ideas themselves. And that is precisely the centerpiece of Hume's philosophy, and the centerpiece as well of part 4, as we will see next week. In short, what happens is that the mind comes to experience not with ideas, not with impressions, but with a disposition to form habits of association. Now that Hume has no explanation of why we have these habits, and he has no demonstration that we must have them. He simply observes that we have them and reports on them. And he thinks that everybody has this disposition. The disposition is prior to the habits. We come to the experience with the disposition to form habits of a particular sort. We could have different dispositions, just as Kant says we could have different categories. But we come to experience with this disposition. And because we do, when we are presented with a constant conjunction of resembling instances, we develop a habit of expecting the second when we once again see an instance of the first. Now, what determines the fact that we associate, that we treat one instance of fire as like another instance of fire? And the answer to that is simple resemblance. When we see fire many different times, we notice that the different fires resemble one another. Now you might say, well, there are many different kinds of fire. And later on in part 4, we will see that Hume has a great deal that's very exciting and interesting to say about that complicating fact, which leads Hume to a position that is even more radical than the one that he's articulating here. But we'll get to that next week. So this is the story. We come to experience with a disposition to form habits of a certain sort. Experience presents us with resembling instances repeatedly. That constant conjunction of resembling instances triggers our disposition, so we form a habit of association. That habit of association leads us to think of the second when we see the first, or an instance. We think of an instance of the second when we see an instance of the first. Because of the strength of the habit, the idea that we form of the second is enlivened. In short, we believe it. We believe it to be real. That, in sum, is the totality of Hume's explanation of where we get causal inference from and how it functions in particular cases. Now Hume says something quite astonishing on page 88. He says, perhaps it will appear in the end that the necessary connection depends on the inference instead of the inference depending on the necessary connection. And I confess, when I first read that, my mind exploded because I remembered a famous passage in the Critique of Pure Reason, since I had just read the critique in Lewis's course. Here is the passage. I don't know, it's probably, if you've read the critique at all, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's a very famous passage. It's from the first edition Deduction. And it is from A 126, 127. In order to read this, I must actually put on a different pair of glasses. These are my Kant reading glasses. Kant says, the understanding is something more than a mere power of formulating rules through comparison of appearances, which is basically what Hume had said. It is itself the lawgiver of nature, save through it, nature, that is, synthetic unity of the manifold of appearance according to rules, would not exist at all, for appearances as such cannot exist outside us. They only exist only in our sensibility. And this nature as object of knowledge and an experience with everything which it may contain is only possible in the unity of apperception. Well, that sounds very high-toned and powerful, as indeed it is. But the claim that the understanding is the lawgiver to nature is, if you think it through carefully, nothing more nor less than Hume's rather simple statement. Perhaps in the end, it will appear that the necessary connection depends on the inference, instead of the inferences depending on the necessary connection. That, once again, he's dancing backwards on heels. That is Hume, 42 years before the publication of the Critique of Pure Reason, asserting essentially what Kant had said. Now, there is one fundamental thing that Hume lacks that Kant provides, and that allows Kant to produce an argument for the causal maxim, not simply an account of the way in which the mind works. And next week I will talk about that. But a great deal of what Kant was saying about causation is anticipated by these remarks by Hume. At this point, Hume launches on a long discussion, which I must confess I find very uninteresting, so I'm not going to waste any time on it. I mean, just so you know, I'll go back to the first page here of my notes and read you all the names of all the sections that we're skipping. There's of the effects of other relations and other habits, of the influence of belief, of the probability of chances, of the probability of causes, of unphilosophical probability. All of that, it's Hume at his most charming, but it's not essential to the argument. Now what happens in section 14 is that Hume states the one question that has not yet been answered by everything else that he has said. Hume says, we must now return upon our footsteps and all the way back to where we left him in section 7 or 8 to examine that question which first occurred to us and which we dropped in our way, namely, what is our idea of necessity when we say that two objects are necessarily connected together? Upon this head, I repeat what I have often had occasion to observe, that as we have no idea that is not derived from an impression, we must find some impression that gives rise to this idea of necessity if we assert we have really such an idea. It's at this point, as we shall see, that Hume invokes the impressions of reflection. You remember when at the very beginning of the treatise, Hume distinguishes impressions of sensation from impressions of reflection. And the impressions of reflection that he has in mind at that point are such things as the passions, desire, aversion, hate, love, and also the moral sentiments, approval and disapproval. Those are impressions of reflection. Remember what an impression of reflection is. We have an impression of sensation. We form an idea of it. That idea then has a new effect upon the mind itself. We reflect upon the idea, and from the mind itself, a new impression is generated, which is not derived from sensation and is not a copy of any impression of sensation. I see a chocolate cake. I think about the chocolate cake. I think about eating the chocolate cake. And in me there arises a totally new and unique, simple impression, the impression of desire. The impression of desire is not derived from the impression of the cake, and it is not a copy of the impression of the cake. It's a new impression that comes from inside me. It is an impression of reflection. Same thing Hume thinks, because he's a moral sentiment philosopher, about the sentiments of moral approval and moral disapproval. Never mind all of that. What Hume is here going to claim is that the impression of necessity, the idea of necessity, is a copy of a new impression of reflection, an impression that comes when we reflect upon this habit we have formed. Now, as I will suggest in a moment, Hume is actually wrong about this. We can all identify the impression of desire that we feel when we desire a piece of chocolate cake. We can all identify the feeling of approval that we experience when the moral sentiment of approval in us is generated, let us say, by our observation of a good act, of a generous act, of a selfless act. But Hume is going to have to do something which is very, very iffy. He's going to have to claim that we have an impression of necessity without actually being able to show it to us. He's going to say, in effect, it must be that because there's no place else it could come from. And I'll suggest in a moment what's really going on there. But here is what Hume has to say. He says, his argument is very simple. Nothing about one perception of fire followed by one perception of heat provides me with any impression of necessity. But repeated perceptions of fire followed by perceptions of heat produce in me a habit or determination to expect heat the next time I perceive fire. And that determination, says Hume, to expect the heat the next time I perceive the fire, is the impression of which my idea of necessity is the copy. So it turns out that according to Hume, my idea of necessity is a copy not of an ordinary impression of reflection, it is a copy of a mental habit. And that mental habit is not, it's a function of the mind, it's not an impression. So my idea of necessity is in fact not a copy of an impression. It is an idea of an activity of the mind, namely this habit that we have formed, or more generally, it is an idea of the disposition we have to form habits of a certain sort. Our idea of the causal connection of fire with heat is a copy of the habit we have formed of expecting fire with heat. But our idea of causation in general and of the necessity of causation is a copy of the disposition to form habits like the habit of associating fire with heat. That really, it turns out, if you look at the argument carefully, is what Hume is saying. And I don't think Hume himself understood that, because it goes so far beyond the elements that he laid down in the first sections of part 1. Hume says somewhat later on, though the several resembling instances which give rise to the idea of power have no influence on each other, and that can never produce any new quality in the object which can be the model of that idea, yet the observation of this resemblance produces a new impression in the mind, which is its real model. For after we have observed the resemblance in a sufficient number of instances, this is on 164 and 165, we immediately feel a determination of the mind to pass from one object to the next attendant, and to conceive it in a stronger light upon account of that relation. This determination is the only effect of the resemblance, and therefore must be the same with power or efficacy, whose idea is derived from the resemblance. So Hume in effect says, we have the idea of a necessary connection of cause and effect. It can't come from any place else except from a reflection on this habit. Therefore, that must be the source of the idea. But he can never actually exhibit the impression. And so Hume concludes that this new impression, of which the idea of necessary connection is a copy, must be an impression of reflection. Now, that brings the argument of part 3 to an end. It's important to understand what has happened here and what hasn't happened. Two things have happened. First, Hume has, in a very brief passage, devastated the arguments to prove the necessity of causation. He has, and the argument is so simple that it takes no time at all to state. The argument is simply this: the idea of the cause can always be distinguished from the idea of the effect. The thing we identify as cause is distinguishable from the thing we identify as effect. Since the two are distinguishable, they are so far separable in the imagination that we can imagine one occurring without the other. Since we can imagine one occurring without the other, it cannot be that there is a necessity connecting the two, because if there were, we wouldn't be able to imagine one without the other. Just to give an example that Hume doesn't give, if I think of the two premises of a valid syllogism, and then I think of the conclusion, I cannot imagine by any stretch of the imagination, by any power of imagination, I cannot imagine in any way that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man without also imagining that Socrates is mortal. I cannot do that, because the conclusion follows necessarily logically from the premises. That's the only kind of necessity there is, Hume says. And if causation is not that kind of necessity, then it is no kind of necessity. That's the negative argument in the first part of the treat of part 3. The rest of part 3, and that takes Hume almost no time to do, The rest of part 3 is devoted to this long, complicated explanation of where we get the idea from, since we clearly have that idea. How it is that we come to believe in causes and effects, since so obviously we do. And to give that explanation, Hume is forced to turn not to the objects, not to logic, but to the functioning of the human mind, to the innate disposition of the mind to form certain kinds of habits when it is presented with certain patterns in its sensory experience, and developing those habits to expect the second of a pair of constantly conjoined instances when presented with the first, and not only to expect the second, but furthermore to believe that the second exists, because the habit associates the two so much together that it conveys to the idea of the effect a good deal of the force of the impression of the cause. On top of that, Hume says, when we think about this habit of the mind, we reflect upon this habit of the mind, we form the idea of necessity of connection, because that idea is an idea not about what connects the objects, but rather it is an idea about what the mind does when it is presented with this experience. In short, causation is not a necessary connection of objects or events in nature discovered by the mind. Causation is a habitual and enlivened association of ideas that the mind imputes to objects and events in nature. In short, the mind is the lawgiver to nature, as Kant says. So it turns out, and I had never thought of it this way before until I was preparing this lecture, that causation is, according to Hume, a grand universal pathetic fallacy. It is an imputation to the world of things that are in us. And in religion, we do that by supposing that sentiments that we have are actually in the world. And what Hume is saying is that pathetic fallacy, which literary critics make a great deal of, is the foundation of all of our causal reasoning. But that's not the end of the story, because there is, it turns out, much more that Hume has to say in part 4. In fact, radical and revolutionary as part 3 is, I think that part 4 is even more interesting and more difficult to get your hands around. And I'm going to have a lot to say about that. I hope I can get all through it in 1 hour next time, but I may not, in which case I may have to lap over to yet another lecture. Now, we have some more time, or we have all the time in the world. I mean, I'm sitting here in quarantine in Carolina Meadows in North Carolina. I might as well be on the moon. I haven't been, the only time I've been out of Carolina Meadows in the last 9 weeks was to take my wife to the doctor when she hurt her wrist. That was a big, exciting move for us. We put our masks on. We actually drove out the front door of the community, and when we came back, they checked us in, took our temperature, and told us we had to self-quarantine for 2 weeks, which we did. That's been the most exciting moment of the last 9 weeks for us. So we've got all the time in the world. So I'm open for questions and comments from anybody. Just unmute yourself and go ahead and talk. I've driven you. Yes. Yeah.
I have a quick question then. Do you think that Hume was so unquestioning of the direct realism that that's what kept him from taking that further step that Kant took? Was it that he didn't question the direct realism?
No, to put it simple-mindedly, and maybe I'll talk about this at the end of the next lecture, what Kant brought to the discussion that goes beyond Hume was the idea of the unity of subjective consciousness. The entire argument of Kant's critique starts with the proposition that the I think can attach to all of my representations. And that makes it possible for Kant to derive an argument we'll see next time that Hume actually has you may remember this if you've read the treatise, he describes the self as a heap or bundle of impressions, but not as unified. He describes it at one point brilliantly, I can't call it exactly to mind, as a stage, as the characters on a stage play, except there is no stage, there are just the characters. Hume doesn't have the idea that you could found an entire argument on the fact of the unity of subjective consciousness. Hume knows that that's a problem, and I'll talk a lot about that section in a little next week. But I've just an ad for something to do about my hurting knees, which don't hurt, just popped up on my computer. This is really weird teaching this way. But at any rate, that when we talk next week about the materials of part 4, we will see exactly in what sense Hume is a direct realist. And I think that Hume, and that's the most exciting part of the book in my opinion, but I think the thing that Hume did not recognize was that the I think attaches to all my representations, that there is a unity of consciousness that is the premise, is the starting point. You can put it this way. Imagine Hume and Kant were brought before us and had a debate with one another. You could imagine Kant, I dream of this sometimes. You could imagine Kant saying to Hume, I'm going to ask you to grant my premise, and you are going to be unable to refuse to grant it, because even if you say that you refuse to grant it, you will be granting it. The premise is that the I think attaches to all my representations. And if you want to say, I think that you are wrong, Immanuel Kant, you will by so doing grant my premise. The only thing that you could possibly do is just to throw up your hands and walk off the stage and leave me the winner of the debate. You must grant my premise if you want to engage with me, and from that premise, I will derive the validity of the causal maxim. That's what happens in a really exciting way in the Critique of Pure Reason, as you know, Susanna.
Right.
And that goes beyond anything that Hume was capable of thinking. Okay. That's where the real difference lies, in my view. I mean, obviously, they're different in so many different ways that somebody might say, of all the ways in which they're different, you pick this one little thing, and I say yes, because that's what the whole thing depends on. But that's just my way of saying that's my interpretation.
No, I think it's a much richer distinction to rely on to draw the difference between Hume and Kant. So I like it. Thank you.
Yeah.
One question I had, just about the example of fire. Wasn't sure if that was a great example that he used of causality or not, because I wonder if something like heat isn't simply a quality of fire, in the same way that flowers and odors, certain odors particular to flowers, let's say, the odor is a quality of the flower. We would never say that the flower causes the odor.
Sure we do. Of course we do. Can you imagine now, this is where photoshopping and modern technology enables us to demonstrate the correctness of Hume's argument without thinking up hokey examples like centaurs and satyrs and so forth. Can you imagine a flower that is presented to you in such a way that it doesn't have the odor? Of course you can. All you have to do is think of, simple example, if you lose your sense of smell, but never mind that, you can distinguish the smell from the flower. Therefore, you can imagine one without the other, and for purposes of making a smell-o-vision movie or whatever, you could perfectly well present the flower and attach to it a different odor.
But aren't we prioritizing vision then? Can I imagine a flower that I can't see?
Sure. Well, you'd have to ask somebody who's blind, and I think the answer is yes. But how does somebody who's blind learn to use the word flower? By feel, by various.
But all these things then are qualities of the flower to me. It doesn't mean that they're caused by this thing called flower.
Well, yes, but they're distinguishable from one another.
Mhm.
Since they're distinguishable from one another, they could occur one without the other. You say the heat is a quality of the fire. To be sure, in the way it's a quality of the heat. The heat is a quality of the fire in the way that the motion of the second billiard ball is not a quality of the first billiard ball. So that's quite correct. The smell of the flower is a quality of the flower in the way that the motion of the second billiard ball is not a quality of the motion of the first billiard ball. But you can imagine, you can distinguish between the feel of the flower and the smell of the flower, or the taste of the flower and the smell of the flower, or the look of the flower and the smell, or the sound of the flower if you hit it on something. And since you can distinguish them, they are, since they are distinguishable, they are, Hume says, so far separable that it is not logically impossible for one to occur without the other. And since it is not logically impossible for one to occur without the other, then that it follows that they cannot be necessarily connected. Now you might say, without that smell, I wouldn't call it a gardenia. Well, that's the married man example that Hume gives. Although it is true that you can't be a husband without having a wife, you can be a man without having a wife or a husband. You can be a man without being married. And in the same way, although you can't be a gardenia without having that smell, if having that smell is a part of the definition of the gardenia, everything about the gardenia except the smell can occur without the smell. Or you can so far imagine it to occur that it is not logically impossible for it to occur. And that's all Hume needs.
Wouldn't it be possible to say something like that the smell itself could exist without the flower?
Yes.
The perfume makers do this kind of thing. I mean, the smell, we know the smell would be produced by some chemical reaction, something going on in the flower, but that can be, once you know what that is, it could be constructed artificially and could exist totally with no flowers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you don't even need an elaborate explanation like that. All you need to be able to do is to distinguish the smell from the rest of the flower.
Yeah.
And if you can distinguish the two, then they are so far distinguishable that they are separable. And if they are separable, then one can occur without the other. And that's all Hume needs. He doesn't need an explanation. He just needs the possibility. That shows that they're not necessarily connected. And that's, now, once Hume has established that, then he can go on in the ordinary way to ask, gee, I wonder why flowers do actually smell that way. And then you do an examination of the chemistry of the flower and you discover why, and you take a look at the structure of the nose and the sensory cells in the nose, and that that explains it. But from the point of view of demonstrating that there's no necessary connection, all you have to do is to ask, could I imagine one occurring without the other? And the answer is obviously yes. And as I say, in these days when people are photoshopping photographs all over the place, and when they're creating things like my mind goes, what was Avatar, the movie Avatar, or any other modern movie that, that's a science fiction movie, or just Spider-Man. Is it possible for somebody to jump around like a spider and to jump from building to building? Well, it's so far possible that you can imagine it. And not only can you imagine it, you go to the movies and see it, because they can produce what looks like, looks as though somebody's doing that. Nobody's actually doing it, but all that's required is that you can imagine the sensation, the impression of the effect without the impression of the cause, or vice versa. I mean, you could make a funny movie in which, somebody like, I don't know, Groucho Marx steps up to the pool table and hits the cue ball with a cue, and the ball cruises up to the object ball, and the object ball doesn't go anywhere. And then Harpo takes out his flute or his trumpet and blows a note on it. I mean, you can do all of this. We've been living with this stuff all our lives, whereas Hume had to think of things like centaurs.
I just wanted to quickly say that, yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with everything you're saying. I guess I was hung up on the idea of this as an example of cause, rather than just being part of the quality of the thing. Like what was the causal relation between our different sensations of the same thing? Like why this was a good example of causality. I guess that's where I was getting hung up.
Okay, well, I don't want to. I've got nothing invested
That's
in
fine,
flame,
yeah.
so I just pick any example that you find plausible, and I'll make the same argument with that example.
Sure.
But I see your point, because
Okay.
although
Like
I don't
the
know,
billiard balls work fine. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
good, okay,
I have
Yes.
a question.
yes,
So he is giving a causal explanation of causal inference, would you say? And that would be that this causal explanation would be subject to the same critique of the idea of causal necessity. Is he? I mean, he seems in speaking of habits and so on. I don't see Hume directly relating, acknowledging that this is language of that he's using causal language himself in
oh yeah,
this account.
that's a very good point, and you're right, and he does acknowledge it. In that he calls his system a system of natural belief, and it has two parts. First of all, it has the negative part, which is a refutation of the claim of logical necessity of causal inference, and second is the explanation, and obviously it is an appeal to, as you say, to causation, to the habits of the mind, to the dispositions of the mind, and so forth. Hume does not think that that demonstrates the necessity of causation. He simply thinks that it is an empirical, it's an attempt to give an empirical explanation of why we believe these things. And anybody who doubts them is free to doubt it. There's nothing Hume can do to demonstrate that you can't doubt this, because of course you can. Can you imagine a human being who doesn't have these dispositions? Of course you can. Can you imagine somebody? Now, let's take a more important point, which Hume does talk about at some length when he's refuting his possible critics. Can you imagine a world in which these dispositions work up to a point and then stop working, so that causation disappears from the world? Yes, you can imagine it. Can you imagine a situation in which these habits evolve over time or change? Hume didn't have the notion of evolution, but he certainly had the notion of change. Could there be a place in the world where people live and don't have these habits, but have different dispositions or no dispositions at all? Yes is the answer.
So that would be a big difference from Kant.
Exactly.
So for Kant, that's engraved in stone, the categories, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or rather, it's derived. It's not so much engraved, it's derived. Kant actually has an argument from a premise that he thinks is irrefutable, from which he can derive the validity of the causal maxim. And that's the fundamental difference between the two of them.
Yeah.
That's right. The actual operations of the mind described by Hume are very similar to the operations of the mind described by Kant. And I'll say more about that next week. What's different is that Kant has an argument to show that it must be this way. And Hume simply says, I observe that this appears to be the way things go. And he's quite casual about it. He's quite happy to say, well, that just does seem to be the way the mind works. And if you think not, what can I say? He doesn't think he can refute somebody who's a skeptic about his own views.
But the fact that these habits persist, is that something of a miracle from his point of view, or just?
Well, it can't be a miracle, because a miracle is an act that violates the laws of nature.
Yeah,
so
but since
a miracle,
it is, right.
A miracle, it's not. But it's a fortunate fact, because we'd really be lost without them. I mean, we'd stumble around not having any clue what was coming next. You might present an evolutionary argument, but of course, an evolutionary argument is a causal argument.
Yeah.
it is a happy fact that we are so disposed that when we see many instances of one billiard ball hitting another and the second one moving, we develop a habit of expecting the second to move when the first hits. Otherwise, there'd be no playing billiards, which I think probably would have bothered Hume more than some things. But I mean, you're quite right. This is not, in the end, the second part of part 3 is not, so to speak, a refutation of the first part. He lays down his negative arguments in the first part, and then he goes on to ask, how does the mind work so far as we can make out? And he gives us this description. But things get freakier. We'll discover this next week. Things get a lot freakier next week, because next week we go beyond what we can observe to things that we can't possibly observe, like the fact that objects continue to exist when we're not observing them. And it's not that, and there's no way around the fact that we believe things that we cannot possibly observe. Never mind that we haven't observed them many times and developed a habit. We can never observe them even once, and yet we believe them. And so Hume has an elaborate story, a very exciting story about how we arrive at that strange conclusion, which is what peoples our world with people and objects and things. And I will next week, I will draw on my long experience as a father of little babies many, many years ago to talk about the way in which Hume, who probably never saw a baby in his life, managed somehow to grasp the fundamental functioning fact of how you teach babies little things like, well, just to get ahead of myself, all of you, I suspect, know that if you hold a rattle up in front of the crib of a tiny baby and rattle it, shake it, the baby responds to the rattle. Then you can play this game in which you make it disappear. You put it behind your back and the baby's face falls. And then you bring it out again and the baby gets excited and you make it disappear and the baby's face falls. After a while, the baby learns that the rattle exists even when it's not looking at it. And the baby knows that the rattle exists, and then he wants you to produce the rattle again. That's an enormous big step. And then you take the really exciting, I'm getting ahead of myself. You take the really exciting step of making it disappear around the right side, switching hands and making it reappear around the left side. And the baby eventually learns that not only does the rattle exist when she's not looking at it, the rattle moves around when she's not looking at it and appears in a different place, and it's the same rattle. That is an enormous discovery, and Hume has very exciting things to say about it, not about rattles, but about that fact about human beings. Well, I'm going to stop there because I'm getting ahead of myself and giving you the guts of next week's lecture. So with that, I will bid you all a farewell if I can figure out how to do this. Here we go. I'm going to end it now, and it will stop recording when I end it. So I will see you all next week.